Has this ever happened to you? Wow, this thing looks really nice on my screen. I wonder how it would look if it were gathering dust on my shelf. What about this? Wow, that collectible statue looks really nice. Where can I... Oh. If you want to turn game models into dust catchers for your shelf, this is the right video for you. I will assume that you want to get something to 3D print, that you don't know too much about Blender, and that you want to learn only what's absolutely necessary for you to get a printable model. Don't be too alarmed by how long the video is. You'll have something to print by somewhere around here, and the rest of the video covers your options in case your model is too low poly for your tastes. While this video mainly uses Guild Wars 2 as an example, this tutorial can generally be used for other games as well. There's a very important note we need to discuss. We'll be getting our models from the game through forbidden magic of DLL injection. This is super haram for multiplayer games. If you are trying to get a model from a multiplayer game other than Guild Wars 2, don't. Or at least head over to Reshade Wiki and check if your multiplayer game appears on the naughty list. If it does, bans are 100% guaranteed. If it instead appears on the OK list, you can proceed at your own risk. If you're trying to get a model from Guild Wars 2 specifically, this has been tolerated by ArenaNet since forever, but that doesn't mean this will remain the case forever. You are still doing this at your own risk. However, there's a good chance that as long as BlishHUD and ArcDPS won't get you banned, this probably won't get you banned either. Second important note. Is this copyright infringement? Potentially yes. Some game studios will tolerate and or allow it under their fan art policy if you're doing this for personal use. Commercial use? Haram AF. Check terms of service and other relevant policies to find if and to what extent your game studio will allow this. And last but not least, certain games may have strong modding communities with tools that allow you to browse through game models in a less contrived way. This is not the case with Guild Wars 2, however. Now that the important bits are covered, let's get into the software you'll need. First, Intel GPA to extract the model, Blender to get the model into a printable state, Prusa Slicer so you can preview the printing process. Everything on this list is free. You will need your money for the prints. Speaking of prints, you should have a good idea about how big you want your figure to be once printed, and also how you want to print your mini. If you want to play some D&D with Guild Wars 2 homebrew, your mini should be about 3 to 4 cm tall for a human and 5 for Norn or Char, all on a 25mm base. If you want a shelf decoration instead, you probably want to aim for at least 10 cm tall at minimum. As for printing, the two most realistic options in 2025 are FDM and resin. Going the FDM route is cheaper and also easier. FDM printers are far more common too. If you Google for 3D printing service, FDM options are plenty and resin options not so much. Besides the price, FDM printers can generally print bigger than resin. They are, however, not very well suited for printing miniatures. FDM printers aren't capable of printing tiny details. There's very few people who will be prepared to print your mini at layer heights smaller than 0.1 mm. 1/10 of a millimeter sounds tiny, but it's absolutely huge if you are looking at your mini within an arm's length away, and painting your mini properly will make those layer heights even more obvious. Additionally, thin but tall features are incredibly fragile and will break if you look at them the wrong way. Resin printers are a bit harder to find and prints tend to be more expensive. They offer superior detail though, so if you want something that will fit your shelf, that's the route you want to go. Note that resin printers are generally smaller. Pre-corona, enthusiast market printers could print minis with a footprint this big, while still retaining superior detail. Nowadays, with the likes of Saturn 3 and 4, enthusiast-grade printers can print this big. Point is, you want to print resin, even if it costs more. However, printing resin might require you to print mini in multiple parts, which is something you want to keep in mind. If you already know someone who can 3D print your mini for you, then ask them what's the largest model size their printer can print, and then plan accordingly. With that out of the way, it's time to open the graphics monitor. It will need admin permissions to run, so click yes when you get the pop-up. Once the program opens, open the game picker and navigate to the game launcher. Select the game launcher's exe and then click run. If you bought your game on Steam, you will need to run Steam through the graphics monitor and then launch the game from Steam as normal. This applies to other stores as well. Once the game is launched, find a corner to pause in. If the bartender is being annoying, inform them that Ascalonian Nash, Ebon Hawk Pashabo, and then pose your character the way you want. By the way, if you understood the previous sentence in full, you should really head over to the Slovenian version of this video. Once you're satisfied with the pose, press Ctrl-Shift-C to capture the frame. This will cause the game to freeze for a bit, few seconds in Guild Wars 2 and older games, but the freeze can last for a few minutes in modern, graphically demanding games like Horizon Zero Dawn. Once you're done capturing, exit the game. If you ran the game through Steam, quit Steam and relaunch it normally. Same goes for any other store. You risk ban in other multiplayer games if you don't. After that, double-click your capture from the sidebar on the right side. Note that Frame Analyzer needs some time to start up, so don't be too impatient if nothing happens immediately. Otherwise, you could end up with multiple instances of Frame Analyzer open. Once the frame capture is opened, you will notice an API log tab in the sidebar to the left. You are interested in items that say draw indexed, as those contain the meshes that make up your character. With Guild Wars 2, you can select the first 10 or so draw indexed calls and get your model. You can select a range of calls with shift click. After you click your first draw index calls, you will get a second sidebar with 3 sections. You are interested in the output section. Click the geometry entry. This will open the preview panel that will show all the meshes that selected draw index calls will draw. If the preview contains any unwanted items, you can remove them by control-clicking draw index calls that aren't supposed to be selected. If your character is missing some parts, try control-clicking unselected draw index calls until your character seems complete. Once you're happy with your selection, you can export the meshes into a file that you'll use later. If you want to export a different character instead, you should switch to the Frame Statistics tab. Click Options in the Output section until you find something that resembles a game screenshot in the preview. Then, click on the model you want to export. This should switch the left sidebar to the Pixel History tab. There, pick a draw indexed call. The correct option is usually near the bottom and will usually contain a colored square, color that should ideally match with the color of the pixel you just clicked. If you choose correctly, at least a part of the character should turn purple, and if it hasn't, click a different option until you get the result you expect. Repeat this procedure until the entire character is colored purple. Don't forget that you have to control-click draw index calls to add or remove them from selection. Once the character is completely purple, click the geometry option in the output section, give it a spin to verify that everything you need is selected, and export the model. If you're trying to do this on a somewhat modern game, some options in the Frame Statistics tab won't have a preview image, and some will have many due to how modern game engines work. The outputs you are interested in will end with RTV inside brackets. You can pick any that resembles the scene. Then start clicking on the character you want to export as before. Now it's time to open Blender. Before we start doing any real work, there's a few add-ons we need to install and enable. Go to Blender Preferences, click the Extension tab and install Modifier Tools and 3D Print Toolbox. Then head over to Add-ons tab and make sure that both of these add-ons are enabled. Once you've installed and enabled the add-ons, open the Overlays drop-down and enable the Face Orientation option. This option colors the outside of the model blue and the inside red. Hello, Editor Me here. I've been working on this video for so long that Blender released a new update. In this update, the outside of the model will be grey, not blue. However, I am not going to re-record all this. Anyway, If you can see any red when viewing your model normally, or if you see any blue when you clip through the wall of the model, then you've got a problem that you need to fix. But do keep in mind that if your model is blue from every angle, that doesn't mean it's okay. Now, let's cover Blender basics. You rotate around some point in space by holding down the middle mouse button and dragging around. If you hold down Shift while dragging, you move around the space. Mouse scroll is zoom. Numpad 1, 3, 7 are front, side and top view. Numpad 9 shows your model from the opposite side. If your keyboard lags the numpad, that's really your fault for not buying a real keyboard. Fortunately, you can achieve the same by using this gizmo. This thing on the left is the toolbox. If you see a triangle in the bottom right corner, that means this tool has multiple options. If you click and hold the button, this will open a menu with all the other options for this tool slot. By default, Blender opens in object mode. In object mode, you can click objects to select them and then move them around, resize them, etc. By using this drop-down, you can switch to sculpt mode and edit mode. You can also switch to edit mode at any time by pressing tab. In edit mode, you can manipulate vertices, edges and faces of an object. These three buttons control whether your select tool will select vertices, edges or faces. You can also use keyboard shortcuts, 1 for vertex select, 2 for edge select and 3 for face select. Once you're done playing around with geometry of the object, you can use tab to return back to the previous mode, in this case object mode. I would also like to point out the grid. Grid has multiple levels. At almost any given time you can see 2 levels of a grid, and the darker grid is 10 times denser than the lighter grid. What level of the grid you see changes as you zoom. The default Blender project opens with some objects already on the scene. We can delete light and camera right away because we won't be needing those, but let's leave the cube for a little bit longer. This is Blender's default unit cube. It's 2 by 2 by 2 units big. By default, Blender will show 1 unit as 1 meter. Most slicers will assume that 1 unit is 1 millimeter. This means that 1 meter in Blender is 1 millimeter when printing. If that bothers you, you can go to settings and change the default unit. I'm lazy, so I just pretend that when I see 1 meter in Blender, that actually means 1 millimeter. With this out of the way, we can now import the mesh we exported from Intel GPA. If you are using Blender 4.3 or newer, you can just drag the file into Blender and click Import on the dialog. Now that we imported our model, we can start fixing it. The size of the model we imported depends on the game. Most of the time it's going to be way smaller than you actually want. Sometimes it might be a lot bigger. Let's start by fixing that. Every model has its origin point. This point is somewhat important because it's considered the center of the model. Scaling scales towards and away from this point, and rotating rotates around this point. You probably want to have that point in the center of your character, otherwise you could be seconds away from being annoyed. Right-click the model, set origin, origin to center of mass. There's 2 options, you can pick any. For the purposes of this video, they are pretty much the same. After you select any of the options, press Enter or click anywhere to set origin. If you didn't delete the default unit cube, you can use that to get the feel for the grid scale. If the cube covers 2 1mm squares, then this big square is 1 cm and 10 of those is 10 cm. Press S to scale the model and move the mouse to change the size to however big you want. Then, if scaling moved your model somewhere you don't want, you can press G to move the model. If the model is rotated in a weird way, you can press R to rotate it. By default, scale resizes the model in all directions equally. G will move the model perpendicular to the viewing direction and R will rotate the object around the viewing direction. Note that the object can be scaled and rotated differently in all 3 directions, so make sure that the model looks correct from front, from the side and from the top. Numpad 1, 3 and 7 are your friends. If you see that your model is squished, you can scale the model along a specific axis. Before you scale your model, press Ctrl A, select rotation and press Enter or click anywhere in order to apply rotation. If you don't, your model will not scale correctly. Then press S followed by X, Y or Z in order to scale your model along the chosen axis. You can also press S followed by Shift X, Shift Y or Shift Z in order to scale along the chosen plane. This trick also works for rotation. R followed by X, Y or Z will lock rotation along the selected axis, and G followed by X, Y or Z will lock movement along the selected axis. If your character appears mirrored, you can flip it by scaling your model by a factor of -1. You can quickly achieve this by typing S-1. This will also turn your model upside down, so if you'd rather avoid the hassle, you can also do SX-1 or SY-1. The end result is the same in both cases, the only thing that's different is the rotation of the model. You can also type a number when rotating and moving. For example, RX180 will rotate the model 180 degrees. If you're from America, that's about 360 degrees Fahrenheit. Now you know why it's called Xbox 360. You will likely notice that no matter how you scale the model, it will continue to remain squished to some extent. The perspective of the model is wrong, and we need to correct it. We need the equivalent of perspective transform in image editing programs. In Blender, that's lattices and lattice modifiers. Press Shift-A and select Lattice on the context menu to add lattice to the scene. Scale it so that your model is wholly inside it. Then select your model, head to the Modifiers panel and add a lattice modifier. For the lattice input, select the lattice you just added. Then select your lattice and press Tab to enter Edit mode. With the Select tool, you can select corners of the lattice and then move them around. You will notice that as you move the corners of the lattice, the model gets distorted. Play around with the corners of the lattice until your model looks about right in terms of proportions. You can just eyeball it, as nobody will notice if things aren't exactly 100% as in-game. Once you're satisfied with your model's appearance, tab back to Object mode, select the model, and click Apply All Modifiers. Do note that you can avoid all this lattice work if you feel your model looks good enough after you've resized it. At this point, the model may appear mostly blue, however, that doesn't mean it's in a printable state. In theory, you could do a Yolo % run, that is, throw it into a slicer and let Jesus take the 3D printer content and hope for the best. Maybe the mini would print, but here's the more likely outcome. Okay, the print might get printed somewhat fine, especially if you click the Fix Everything button, but let's show all the problems. This is Prusa Slicer, which converts the STLs you get from Blender into something that 3D printer can work with. As is tradition, slicers allow you to preview the 3D printing process. Prusa Slicer is currently assuming that we are going to print the model with the FDM, aka glorified hot glue gun printer. Bright red is outer wall of our model, everything else is between those walls except for those green things. Green things are supports. Supports are necessary because 3D printers cannot print things suspended in air without supports, and are designed to be broken off. Notice how parts of our model are straight up missing. This is why Yolo % run is not a viable strategy for 3D printing your character. Let's tell Prusa Slicer that we're going to be using a resin printer instead. So far, I've been dodging this warning symbol. If you click it, Prusa Slicer will attempt to fix your model, but it's not going to be good and it may still contain errors. For example, notice this area of our character that is a sea of darkness completely surrounded by red from all sides. That means that your mini will contain a cavity. This is a problem because due to how resin printing works, this cavity will be full of liquid, uncured resin after printing is finished. This is bad because resin is messy, it's toxic, and if there's uncured resin inside your print, there's a good chance that one day the print will develop a crack through which the said liquid resin will escape. Your model will be ruined, and you will have a toxic mess to clean up. If you right-click on the model, you can probably see this Export option on the menu. The problem with this option is that it pretty much destroys your model. Your model is now an unfixable mess, so don't even think about exporting this model from Prusa Slicer and then importing it into Blender. Never ever do this. Asterisk. This is something that you need to keep in mind even if you have someone 3D print your character for you. If they drag their character into their slicer and see all the problems that I've just described, they will tell you, sorry, this model cannot be 3D printed at all. Now that you know why you need to fix your model, it's time to show you how to fix your model. In order for the model to be printable, it needs to have volume. That means we can have any meshes that don't form a 3D shape, and the 3D shapes can't have any holes on their surfaces, which games like to do a lot. The less triangles a game has to render, the faster it's going to run. That's why games often take a lot of shortcuts in order to minimize the amount of triangles they have to draw. In order to have a model that we can properly support and print, we have to undo all these shortcuts, so let's start. By the way, have I already mentioned that now that we are done using the cube and the lattice, we can safely delete them? Let's delete them. At the moment, there's a good chance that triangles that make up our model don't actually connect at the edges. This is a problem because they do need to be connected. This is easily fixable by going to the Modifiers tab, selecting the Weld modifier, and then we specify a really small number. 0.001 is about 100 times smaller than any legitimate detail at this point, so it kind of works for us, but you can add another 0 or 2. Apply the modifier, and now the triangles are connected at the edges. You probably also noticed that adding Weld modifier made Blender apply smooth shading to our model. We don't really want that. In order to make our model appear the way it did before, select the model, right-click and select Shade Flat. This procedure joined adjacent triangles, but it probably didn't combine all triangles into one contiguous mesh. This is actually pretty neat and convenient, because it allows us to sensibly split our character into smaller meshes that we can fix individually. With your character model selected, tab into Edit mode, press A to select all vertices or faces, right-click the model and select Separate by Loose Parts. You will notice that the amount of objects you can see in the outliner panel got rather large, though the exact number, or even the order of magnitude, varies depending on the armor and even the game. Who is going to fix few hundred meshes? Certainly not me, and you are probably waiting for me to drop the good news. So here's the good news. We absolutely can throw away a lot of these objects. Plenty of those objects are tiny details like hair that are fundamentally not worth fixing, or are something else that's ultimately faster to recreate from scratch later. Like these two-dimensional strips coming from these armor flaps. Tab back to Object mode and start clicking the parts you want to keep. This time around, Shift-click is your friend. Do note that in Blender, Undo and Redo can also undo and redo adding objects to selection. As a rule of thumb, select bigger parts and all the details that you want to bother with. If you see tiny repetitive details that aren't terribly complex, hair garbage and things like these bits of armor at the bottom, you are better off recreating those details later, especially since you have the power of copy and paste in your hands. If you're printing resin, free-hanging details shouldn't be thinner than 2mm, and they absolutely 100%, no I'm serious, don't ever, shouldn't be thinner than 1mm unless you're printing it yourself and know what you are doing. For example, this medallion with this chain at this scale is definitely not happening unless the chain is significantly beefed up. Once you're happy with your selection of meshes, right-click on the object and click Move to Collection option. Create a new collection for your selected items and then hide the collection. A large part of your character should now be missing. Look at what remains in the character. Are there any large, absolutely crucial pieces left that you missed the first time around, which also don't look like a complete waste of time to fix? Select them and add them to your new collection. Unhide your new collection so that you can see your character again. Now hide the default collection with remaining loose parts. Does your character look incomplete? Unhide the old selection and select the missing parts and move them over. After you're done, your mesh selection is probably something a bit more manageable. Now it's time to fix all the problems. Press Tab to enter edit mode. We'll be mostly working with edges, so press 2 in order to put selection tools into edge select mode. Create a new collection by right-clicking in the outliner panel and clicking New Collection. Hide all the meshes inside your selection collection and then process them one by one. You can hide all the objects by selecting them in the outliner panel, pressing H and then clicking the eye icon to unhide the first one. The problems you will be seeing can fit into surprisingly few categories of cases. Category 1. The mesh has a hole. Alt-click one of the edges, and Blender will try to select the edge of the hole. Press F to create a new face, and then Ctrl-T to split it into triangles. Once you're done fixing the mesh, move the fixed mesh into the empty collection you created earlier. Also, don't forget to hide the fixed mesh in order to avoid getting jebaited later. Sometimes Blender won't detect the edge of the hole correctly. In those cases, you might need to help Blender a bit by selecting two edges on the opposite sides of the hole. Do the F. You will almost certainly need to do this if the hole you are trying to fill has an exotic shape, such as Category 1.1. This isn't just a hole. We're missing more than half of the object. In those cases, you will often need to create some of the bridges manually. The good old Alt-click and F to fill doesn't work because Blender's fill algorithm will fill the gap in a way that minimizes volume. This is bad for us because we want to fill the gaps in such a way that gives us the largest possible volume. In those cases, we first created the necessary bridges that guarantee that the holes are mostly flat, and then fill the rest by alt-clicking an edge around the hole and doing the F Ctrl-T dance. In some cases, you may need to fill more complex shapes. In cases like this, fill in a way that continues the pattern first, then fill in a way that maximizes volume. Category 2. Parts of the mesh self-intersect. In cases like this, you need to make so it mesh doesn't self-intersect. It's easier to fix issues like this by selecting vertices or faces instead of edges. Keyboard shortcuts: 1 for vertex select, 3 for face select. Shift-click adds or removes items from selection, and Ctrl-click selects the shortest path between the last two clicks, unless, of course, you are using any of the selection tools to select all elements within an area. In this case, Shift plus Draw adds to the selection and Ctrl-Draw removes from it. You can also undo the last selection with Ctrl-Z. With this knowledge, select bits of the mesh that self-intersect and move them out of the way. In some cases, you can delete the offending geometry, but don't forget that you also have to fill any holes that you created this way. Know that the mesh can and should intersect other meshes. It just shouldn't intersect itself. Category 3. Mesh with no volume. In this case, you might be looking at an object that's split into two unconnected meshes. Tab into Object Mode and find the other mesh. Ensure there's preferably 2, but no less than 1 mm of space between the two meshes and that they never intersect. Then select both of them and press Ctrl-J to join them. Then fill the gap between the meshes. You will need to help Blender a bit by creating a few bridges between the two meshes, otherwise Blender won't know how to fill the gap correctly. Verify that you filled the entire gap. If anything was red at the beginning of this process, press A to select all vertices or faces, and then press Shift-N to hopefully turn the model blue. If part of your mesh remains red, you have holes or no manifold geometry. Category 3.1. Mesh with no volume, but in this case there is also no second corresponding mesh. If that's the case, we need to create the second mesh ourselves. Usually it's as easy as going into edit mode, pressing A to select the entire mesh, pressing Shift-D to duplicate it, and then moving the duplicated mesh 1, but preferably 2 mm away. If necessary, you can also scale or rotate duplicated faces. Once everything is where you want to be, press Enter or click to lock the mesh in place. Done. fill the gap between the two meshes as before. Press A to select everything on your mesh, and then Shift N to recalculate normals. This should turn everything blue if all is right. Category 4. Other non-manifold geometry. That covers everything from inner walls to funny 3 or more way joins. This requires quite a bit of work, small amount of thinking, and a large amount of attention. There's 2 egregious examples here, and you'll be quizzed on the second one. First example is the hat, which got a neat red rim after we applied our weld modifier earlier. If we delete half of it, we can see that the upper and the lower side of the hat merge, resulting in a bit of hat that lacks any thickness. We need to restore this thickness. The easiest way to do so is to select all the red faces of the outer rim. Press Shift D to duplicate them and then move them 1, but preferably 2 mm away in whatever direction you deem best and or more realistic. Press Enter or click to lock the duplicated mesh into position. I've chosen to move the duplicated faces up. This means that the old vertices are now the bottom side of the hat, and the newly duplicated vertices are the upper side of the hat. Now, we select all upper faces next to the edge where upper and lower side of the hat merge into the old rim and delete them. Last but not least, we start filling the gap by selecting edges and filling the gap with F followed by Ctrl T to break it into triangles. After we are done, we also check for any stray polygons and delete them. I also don't like this hat shroud, so I'm just going to delete it and fill the gap. Last but not least, press A to select everything, Shift N to recalculate normals. If everything is fine, everything should be blue. And then there's category 5, a little bit of everything and a little bit more. For example, the thing you are getting quizzed on, the tail of a char, which you probably want to keep bushy. This means that you want to fill this gap, but that would result in an inner wall. That means that you need to remove the inner wall first, and there may be more than one. After the wall is removed, fill the gap. While we are removing faces and adding new ones, we can make rough shape of the tail look a little bit nicer by deleting and recreating geometry into a nicer shape. As usual, Edge select, F to fill, and Ctrl T to triangulate are your friends. The end of the tail is a bit of a mess. Because I'm re-recording this for the 4th damn time, I know that this tail can be fixed by just selecting certain faces, deleting them, and then filling the gaps in a more optimal order. However, some models may require a little bit extra work. In this case, you can press K to cut polygons in half as you please. So far, I have neglected to mention one very important thing. Not all meshes will include folds that are obviously visible to you. That's why you should also check all meshes, but especially those with complex shapes, with the 3D Print Toolbox add-on. Click on the 3D Print tab on the right side of the viewport, though if you don't see any tabs on the right side of the viewport, you will have to click this tiny arrow first. Once the 3D Print tab is selected, expand the Analyze option and click Check All. There are a few problems that you can relatively safely ignore, and the ones you can't are bad contiguous edges, but I haven't seen this one happen in any of the models I ripped, intersect face, non-manifold edges, and non-flat faces. If the add-on detects any of the problems of a given type, then that line in the result panel will become a button. You can click that button and the affected faces or edges will get selected. Don't forget to toggle X-ray for best result, as problematic edges or faces could be hidden under the surface. Be very thorough. I've learned these things the hard way, so you don't have to. Oh, and as is tradition, the simplest solution of just filling the holes is not the best one. It's best to delete this entire face and then recreate it again in a way that avoids small gaps and self-intersecting geometry. After you're done fixing the issues, don't forget to recheck the mesh again for any problems that might have appeared or you forgot to fix. Though in this case we can see that no serious problems are left. Fortunately for you, Meshes requiring a lot of work to fix are usually relatively rare, so fixing the model isn't too difficult, but it is a lot. Expect to spend an evening on this. If your model is complex, expect more. In order to give you some practice before we continue, we are going to play a quick game of how do I fix this mesh. If you paid any attention during the last 5 to 10 minutes, that shouldn't be too hard. First example, this is a boot with a hole and some bits of loose geometry, so obviously we delete the loose geometry and then fill the hole. Second example, this armor plate. Obviously we fill the hole, except that the hole is basically half of the object, so we have to connect the missing parts in a way that ensures that the end object will be as big as possible. Example 3, this red part of the belt. Yes, you delete intersecting geometry. Sometimes fixing self-intersections and recreating the geometry can be a lot of work though, so be patient and don't take any shortcuts. You have to fix this, otherwise you could have problems when printing. Now, if you are doing your own printing, you can Yolo it and deal with the consequences, but if you are outsourcing your 3D printing to someone else, don't be an ass. They won't be very happy when they get shit like this in their slicer. Example 4, there's a bit of red on the face. Yes, that's non-manifold geometry. There are two ways of solving this. One is deleting the loose parts, the other is giving the loose parts some volume. Pick whichever option you prefer. Example 5, this shoulder piece. So this one is a little bit of a more complex fix. You can start by moving separate vertices just a little bit in order to give some extra volume to the part and get rid of red. That way, you can also move vertices in order to ensure that the shoulder piece intersects with the rest of the model as much as possible without spoiling the look. You probably also notice that the edge is very sharp and very thin. So, in order to solve this issue in a little bit more elegant way, we can press K for knife and draw our own edges. Then we move the edges a little bit down in order to give the shoulder a little bit of thickness. And for last example, how do you fix this? This is a trick question. You can see that this object is already perfect as it is. However, the problem is that it doesn't intersect with the rest of the character model. So we select some of the bottom faces and move them a little bit down so they intersect with the rest of the model a little bit more. While fixing meshes, you can also reposition any elements that you feel need to be repositioned a bit. For example, you probably don't want your character's leg to clip through the armor, so select the flap, move and rotate away. And while you are at it, make sure that it's at least 1, but preferably 2 mm thick, because the thinner it gets, the more likely you are to encounter problems during printing. And yes, you do need to consider this even if someone else is doing the printing for you. Similarly, you can edit meshes to exaggerate certain features if you so desire. You have a lot of freedom here. You should also pay attention to any fingers, ears or claws. This can also be too thin to print reliably, so make sure to make them thicker. You can thicken fingers and other tiny details in edit mode by manipulating edges and vertices, but you can also switch to sculpt mode, select the inflate brush and make tiny details thicker this way. Though do be careful about self-intersections. If you create any, you need to fix them. Note that having certain features, things like ears, horns and claws, and any other details, and in a sharp point that gets increasingly thin, is generally fine, as long as most of the part is of sufficient thickness. If you wonder why I insist on 1 but ideally 2 mm thin, well, this mini fell from waist-high shelf to the floor. This dwarf had holes in his feet for magnets. The idea was that I could remove the dwarf from the base. However, the magnets ended up being way too weak for that, so I just superglued the feet to the base. But at the end of the day, the Mini didn't survive the 50 kilometers long round trip in the cup holder of my car. it didn't fall, I didn't hit it while shifting gears, the road isn't particularly shit on that particular route, I didn't listen to initial D, and I drove in pensioner mode. The Mini broke off at its feet when I came home and picked it up by the base. This orc shaman has a staff that broke in transport. The sword of this dragonborn also broke off several times and had to be superglued back on. Do note that if you want to print on an FDM printer, but you don't, you will probably need even more than 2mm on the XY plane, because that's what happened with the stuff on my first low percent and smooth percent runs. After you fixed your meshes, it's time to join them together. Now is the time for you to decide in how many pieces you want to print your character. If you want to print in multiple pieces, create a separate collection for every piece and move relevant parts to their respective collections. But for the time being, I'll assume that the character will be printed in one piece, so let's fuse all the meshes together. Collapse the collection with your model and select the top levels in collection, then go into object mode and draw a small cube, it doesn't really matter where, you just have to move it so that it's completely inside your character. Then add a boolean modifier to the cube, select union, for operand type select collection and ensure you are using exact solver. Then select the appropriate collection as collection operand and wait for Blender to finish processing. It can take a while. Then hide the collection. If your character looks incomplete, then you haven't fixed all your meshes properly. Go back, find problematic meshes and fix them. You can narrow down your search for problematic meshes by creating a new collection that should not be nested inside the same collection as the parts you're trying to join. Then unhide the collection with parts and see what meshes appeared. Select the meshes that appeared and move them to your potentially problematic part collection and wait for the Blender to finish recalculating the boolean. Then hide both collections and examine your model again. Repeat this process until nothing goes missing when you hide the collection. The mesh that's causing the issues with your boolean could be any or all meshes in your potentially problematic collection, or it could be any mesh that's touching or overlapping any of the meshes in potentially problematic collection. In this specific case, the problem is that this footage was taken in a parallel universe where we forgot to fix the jerkin mesh. But just because the model looks good from the outside, that doesn't mean it's good enough to print. Just in case, press Shift X and Grave to enter Flywalk navigation and clip through the model. Make sure you can traverse from your character's head to the end of each limb or other appendage without hitting any unexpected walls. While clipped inside your character, you're playing a Soviet campaign. You should see all red and no blue, though if blue parts are tiny, you can ignore them and fix them after you applied the boolean. If you hit any inner walls or any objects blocking your fly path, that can mean two things. It can mean there's a gap between some meshes of your character that you need to fill, but more likely it means that you've got a non-manifold mesh that wasn't fixed properly. Go and find it, especially if you aren't here for the low poly percent. But in our case, our inspection was relatively fine. If you aren't in object mode, go into object mode, then select the cube, go to the modifiers panel and click Apply All. If you don't have modifier tools enabled, click this arrow and click Apply. Wait a bit for Blender to do its thing. You can now probably safely delete all the collections and meshes inside them because you won't be needing them anymore. Or you can keep them if you're just in case hoarder. Your choice. Then tab into Edit mode, press A to select all and Ctrl T Enter to ensure you have no flat faces. Then choose Face Select mode, click any triangle on your character, Ctrl L followed by Ctrl I in order to select all faces not on the surface of your character. Toggle X-ray mode and look at what's selected. If there are any orange bits inside your character, they need to be deleted. Those are cavities, and cavities inside your model are bad. If this process selected too much, you can remove geometry from selection by using Select Lasso tool and holding Ctrl while drawing a lasso around the geometry. Except that with the way I've set this mini up, there are no mistakenly selected faces, so let's undo the removal from selection and delete the faces. If you are not sure whether highlighted areas are selected by mistake, don't worry. You'll know as soon as you exit X-ray mode. Analyze your model with the 3D Toolbox add-on again, just in case, and oh, hey! 112 new non-manifold edges! Let's X-ray again and clip into the model. Hey look, it's some self-intersections. Let's select all the blue bits and delete them. You can also ask Blender to try and resolve those issues on its own by clicking Make Manifold button right here. Sometimes that button can destroy parts of your mesh, but sometimes it will work. In this case, Make Manifold made a hole in our finger, but we can fix this relatively easily. After fixing, we click Check All again. Single digit number, let's check again. Switch to X-ray, yep, that's an infinitely narrow gap. That can be deleted. Click Check All again and 0 non-manifold, 0 intersect faces, 0 non-flat faces. Cool. That concludes our low poly % run. Your model is now printable. Well, actually, it isn't. Editor time here on today's episode of If You Forgot, It's Not Important. I forgot about this cavity on the inside. You need to delete this cavity, otherwise your print will be weakened. While in edit mode, you go and select the walls of the cavity and then delete them. You don't have to select the entire cavity, you just have to isolate the cavity from the rest of the model. Select the polygons where the cavity connects to the rest of the model and delete them. After that, select any polygon on the part of your model that isn't the cavity, press Ctrl L to select all the linked polygons, and then press Ctrl I to invert selection. At this point, only the polygons that make up the cavity should be selected, so you can safely delete them. After you delete the cavity, don't forget to fill all the holes that you may have created, and don't forget to check your model for problems with the 3D Print Toolbox again. This concludes our low poly % run. Your model is now printable. You can export the model into an STL and throw it at your 3D printer. This is how it looks once printed, but please ignore those layer shifts because someone didn't calibrate their printer for this print. But we can do better. In modern games, you'll probably need less of this. Guild Wars 2, however, is over 12 years old at this point, so obviously the models don't have too many details. This is a problem that we can partially fix for almost free. Step 1. While in edit mode, press 2 for edge select. Step 2. Select all the edges that you want to keep sharp. You don't have to select all at once, you can do this in chunks. The edges that you want to keep sharp generally have a few similarities, most notably the angle between the two faces adjacent to the edge. That means that we can save a lot of time by going to the Select menu and then selecting Sharp Edge. By playing with the sharpness slider down there, you can select how sharp the angle needs to be in order to get selected. Play with the slider until you get something that works as a starting point for you. No matter the value on the slider though, edge selection will inadvertently both contain some edges that you don't want to keep sharp and not contain some edges that you do. Feel free to indicate your disagreement with Blender selection by manually selecting and deselecting things that aren't compatible with your wishes. Remember that Lasso Select tool exists and that holding Ctrl while making your selection will remove any edges inside the lasso area from your selection. Do note that I had to recreate the model from scratch for this video, which means that I'm half-assing the edge selection here. Step 3. Select the Item tab and move Min-Crease slider of Edges data to 1. Step 4. Press 1 for Vertex Select. Select all the vertices that you want to keep sharp, such as pointy bits of teeth and claws and weapons. Do note that if all edges leading into a vertex are sharp, the vertex where the edges meet will remain sharp as well, even if you don't set Min Vertex Crease. Step 5. Min Vertex Crease goes to 1. Step 6. Go to Object mode. Add a Subdivision Surface modifier. Use Catmull Clark and set Levels Viewport to 2 or 3. Don't go higher than that, otherwise you might have a very bad time. You probably want to subdivide the mesh in a way that gives you 2 to 10 vertices per millimeter on average. If the angles between the faces are shallow, you can generally get away with less than that. If you want to see the subdivided mesh, and where vertices are on set subdivided mesh before applying Subdivision Surface modifier, You need to zoom in and pay attention to subtle changes in color of your mesh. You can make these changes less subtle and subdivided edges pop out more by going into the shading menu, ticking the cavity checkbox, selecting screen or both, and jacking ridge and valley sliders in screen section to the maximum. Now that you can see where the new mesh will be after you apply the modifier, you can use the ruler to measure the density of the mesh. Ruler will snap to vertices of the subdivided mesh, so you can easily count how many of vertices you will get per given unit of space. Step 7. Examine your model and see if it looks the way you want, and refine creases as you deem necessary. You should also pay close attention to ensure you don't introduce any red to your model. Once you're happy with how thing looks, switch to object mode and apply the modifier. If you don't want to manually sculpt details, that's how far you go. Export your STL, get it printed. As you can see, it's quite a bit of an improvement if you're not a fan of low poly look. But we can do better by sculpting our own detail. Let's start by toggling statistics overlay in this dropdown here and pay attention to the triangles number. Unless your model is very large, try to keep the number of triangles under 5 million. You don't need a top-of-the-line PC for that. If your PC is comparable to mid to high tier PCs from 10 years ago in terms of performance, 5 million triangles should be more than doable without your PC lagging too much. You will need to sculpt detail bit by bit, and you probably want to do it one part of the character at a time, especially if you use a lower-end PC. Start by switching to sculpt mode. By default, tools in sculpt mode can only affect the geometry that is already there, and in this case, the mesh is not dense enough to get sharp details. Ideally, we would want our brush to create additional geometry in order to make our details sharp. If you tick the Dino Topo checkbox, brush strokes will create new geometry as needed. However, Dino Topo can be expensive and laggy, sometimes randomly so. If Dino Topo doesn't work for you, pick a relatively small part of the model you want to focus on, switch to edit mode and select all vertices or faces in the area you want to edit. After selecting the area you want to edit, right-click on the selection and select Subdivide, and make that number as high as needed. You want a pretty dense mesh, though in my case, going smaller than 0.01 mm is way overkill. Click anywhere to apply and wait for Blender to become responsive again. Then switch to sculpt mode and sculpt your details. After you're done sculpting an area, select the area you've just finished, make sure you don't miss a single triangle, and go to Mesh, Clean Up, Decimate Geometry. In the pop-up at the bottom, specify a ratio. Start with a 0.25 and adjust that number to as low as you can go without losing detail. Click anywhere to apply. Before sculpting, you can also decimate parts of your character that won't be really visible once printed out. You can decimate those very aggressively, because nobody will care if these inner parts of those flaps will be low poly. Now, let's quickly go over the sculpt mode. At the bottom, there's brushes, and for most of the time, we will probably want to use the clay strips or layer brush, because those two give you sharp edges with flat tops. If you want to create scratches on a surface, then use Crease Sharp brush, because that brush creates narrow but steep valleys. Also, I know that I shielded for the Dino Top option half a minute ago, but stop using it, do yourself a favor, subdivide. It's going to be much faster, much less lag, much easier to sculpt your details that way. Those two can get you most of the way for basic stuff, but you can also try the other brushes and see what they do. You probably should do that, actually. At the top, you have brush settings. Radius and strength are self-explanatory. Plus and minus switch the brush between adding material to your model and digging a hole, dinky hole. Pressing Ctrl key while dragging temporarily switches between the two modes as well. Holding Shift while dragging will make things smoother. To the right of that, you have a few more drop-downs. In the brush drop-down, you probably want to check the following options. Cavity inverted. This option prevents you from accidentally making parts of your model red again. It's not foolproof though. Front faces only. This option prevents you from accidentally ruining the other side of the mesh that you aren't looking at. Another option you probably want to change is radius unit. By default, the radius unit is view. This means that the brush size changes if you zoom. In this mode, brush will also affect larger area on objects further away from you and smaller area on objects closer to you. If you want to ensure detail of consistent thickness all over your character, you want to use scene for your radius unit. And as usual, you should at least briefly experiment with other options. While you're busy, if you want to paint a piece of detail individually, like, for example, this golden pattern on the shoulder piece, which was painted by dragging a brush on the raised edge, then that detail can't be smaller than 1 or half a millimeter. Anything smaller will be unpaintable. Detail that you aren't going to paint individually, for example, you aren't going to paint each strand of hair or fur individually, you are just going to paint the entire head brown, and then, if you are new to painting, hopefully you will how do I dry brush and follow the instructions in order to add some additional highlights. Anything smaller than 0.25 to 0.1 mm is going to be far too small to see even when looking at the mini up close. But speaking of fur, do you want to add fur, scales, feathers or any other repetitive detail? Open your browser and search for Blender brushes. There's plenty of free ones on the internet. After you download the brushes, you will discover that those are image files. To use them, click the Texture drop-down. Click Add Texture, and then Show Texture in Texture tab. This will open something in the left bar. Under the black box, you have Image Settings. Press Open and navigate to where you downloaded the image files with the brushes. Select the image and click Browse Image, and that's it. Your brush is now stamping the pattern from the image. There's two things you will notice very fast. Clay strips brush is often a rather poor choice for this use case. Use the draw brush instead. And while you are at it, don't forget to set the mapping to area plane. The second thing you'll notice is that if the brush behaves like this, you will just create a mess. Fortunately, there's a solution. Click the stroke drop-down and select Anchored as your stroke method. Then, click on a spot and drag your mouse until you see a desired shape. Once you get the size and orientation as desired, release the mouse. Unfortunately, there is also a problem. Dino-Topo doesn't really work with anchored strokes for some reason, or at least so it seems. Fortunately, the workaround is very easy. Remember when I told you before how to subdivide the mesh in edit mode? Go and do that. Then, disable the Dino-Topo option and sculpt your detail. As you continue working, the triangle count is going up and up. Once it becomes high enough to become a problem, that is, when Blender starts to lag, it's time to reduce the triangle count a bit. Tab into edit mode and select part of your character that you finished sculpting. With your finished area selected, click on the mesh menu, select cleanup, and then decimate geometry. You can usually decimate pretty far, at least 0.25 to 0.1, but often even more. Make this number as low as you can get without losing any detail. You'll generally want flat areas to be made up of few polygons, while density along the edges can be higher. Use your best judgment. Flat areas don't need pointless mesh density. Once you're satisfied with the result of the decimate operation, click anywhere outside the pop-up to apply and continue sculpting until you're done. Hopefully, your model stays blue throughout the entire ordeal. But there are some things that you can't really sculpt. Chain links, chains, ropes, belts, and belt clips are some of the things that you probably want to add to your character. Belt clips are your homework. You drew the cubes and you used booleans. You have all the tools you need to model a belt clip. Single chain links are easy. Go to Object mode, press Shift-A to open Add menu and then select Mesh, Torus. This will create a torus in the center of your scene. Play around with the dialog until you get a chain link of the desired size. But remember, if it's going to be freestanding, it has to be at least 1 mm thick. Anyway, move, rotate and scale the chain link into the desired position. If you're making a larger chain Or if you don't want round links, you tab into edit mode after adding the torus, press Shift Z to enable wireframe mode, select half of the torus, and then press G to move that half of the torus appropriate distance away. Press Shift Z to disable the wireframe mode and go to object mode. Duplicate the single chain link and appropriately rotate and offset the copy. Friendly reminder that you can lock movement along an axis by pressing X, Y, or Z. You can also rotate the link at 90 degrees by pressing R, optionally followed by X, Y, or Z to lock rotation along an axis, and then typing 9, 0, enter. Ensure that chain links overlap at least a little. Join the chain links with union boolean modifier. Delete or hide the other chain link and then add an array modifier. Change the offset factors so that chain links overlap appropriately, and change the count until the chain is just about long enough for your needs. Apply the modifier. At this point, chances are that the chain links aren't a single mesh. In object mode, draw a cube and sink it into the chain. Add a boolean modifier to the cube, union with the chain. Unfortunately, the array modifier introduced a lot of self-intersections into our mesh. This is bad. Those self-intersections will propagate with the boolean modifier, so we have to fix that. Expand Solver options and check self-intersection checkbox. Blender won't like this at all. It may become unresponsive, but you will just have to wait it out. Apply the modifier and delete the original chain. You also probably don't want your chain to be straight. Add another lattice to the scene and resize it so it snugly fits around the chain. Go to lattice settings and increase the resolution along one of the axes in order to slice the chain along its length. Then select the chain and add a lattice modifier to it. Select the lattice again and tab into edit mode and shape your chain by moving lattice vertices around. If the chain isn't deforming correctly, go to lattice settings and try changing interpolation from the default B-spline to something else. If your chain ends up being too long, you can chop it off by drawing a cube around the axis part of the chain and adding a boolean modifier to the chain. This time use difference and use cube as the object. Once you're happy, apply the modifiers and you have your chain. People who know how to do shit in Blender are probably horrified right now, but this honestly feels like least effort, least knowledge required way of achieving this. I suspect curves and curve modifier might be a bit more correct tool for the job, but I've tried to achieve the same effect with curves, and it's a lot less intuitive and a lot more annoying if your skills barely exist. Belts are easy. Draw a long and thin rectangle, tab into edit mode, press Ctrl R, and then scroll the mouse wheel in order to create multiple cuts along its length. Ideally at least about 1 per millimeter. Once you're done, lattice and lattice modifier, you know the drill. Want to add some holes to the belt? Draw a cylinder, sink it in a bit, and then add a boolean modifier to the belt. Pick your cylinder, subtract, apply. If you want a large rope, if rope is thicker than a few millimeters, search for a better tutorial. But if your rope is thinner than 4 or 5 millimeters, you can take some shortcuts. First, go to object mode and draw a long and thin cylinder about 3/4 the desired thickness. Then, Shift A, add a torus. Size it about as big as you want your rope to be, and move it so that the cylinder goes through the center of the torus. The cylinder should fully intersect the inner half of the torus. Press numpad 1 to go into the side view, rotate the torus a bit, and then add the array modifier and stack the torus through the entire height of the cylinder. Toruses should not touch. They should either overlap at least a little or not at all. Otherwise, you might have problems with the boolean later. Then, click the cylinder and add a boolean modifier, union with the torus. Hide the torus. If your cylinder looks kinda like a rope, you're done. If your cylinder looks horrible with a few dashes of red, remember that self-intersection checkbox. If that fixes your red problem, apply the boolean and you're done. If it doesn't, go to the array modifier settings, and either put torsos closer or further apart. Want a net? Okay, editor me here. The net is your homework because this video is long enough as it is, and if you paid any attention in the last 5 minutes, you probably can already guess how to make a net. So let's move on. Use booleans to add any objects that you sculpted to their respective mesh. Do note that booleans on objects with lots of vertices can take a very long time. Longer still if your mesh is broken, so make sure that the things are blue and without holes. If you plan on printing your mini in multiple parts, you need to make sure that the parts will fit together. I'm not doing this right now, but you should ideally be doing this part after you are done fixing the mesh and sculpting your details. Start by ensuring that none of the parts overlap. For each pair of adjacent pieces, you need to subtract one of them from the other with a boolean modifier. Which item is the one you subtract is not too important, but as a rule of thumb, subtract smaller items from bigger items. After subtracting, check that everything is okay. If it's not, for example, the underside of the upper part is completely and utterly fucked, go back and adjust the parts until it looks like the parts could slot into each other. After you've done that, it's time to add pegs and holes. Try to figure out how pieces will slot into each other. Then draw a cube or cylinder that will point in the direction of insertion, and then sink it into your object a bit. My rule of thumb for sizing pegs. Pegs should be between 1/2 and 3/4 as wide as the part that's being inserted. I generally just eyeball how long the peg should be, but probably at least 1/2 centimeter long. Peg hole should be slightly wider than the peg, between 1/4 and 1/2 millimeter if printing resin. You create the peg hole by duplicating the peg, pressing S, and then making it slightly larger. After both the peg and the hole are created, use boolean modifiers to add the peg to the part that should have the peg, and to subtract the hole from the part that should have the hole. That is, unless you also want to add LEDs. If you want to do that, I assume that you know what you are doing in terms of electronics. You will also have to do some additional things. First, you want to create a base for your mini. You want to keep all your resistors inside your base. Chances are you also want to power your mini from a Type-C port hidden in your base. This is your Blender homework. Earlier, I said that your model needs to be solid with no cavities, especially when printing resin. That was a lie, because resin prints are usually printed hollow for practical reasons. If they aren't, bad things can happen. Up to this point, hollowing out models and ensuring the resin drains properly during printing was a problem for whoever will print the mini for you. But if you want LEDs, hollowing the mini is your problem. Export all the parts of your mini and throw them into Prusa Slicer. Select resin printer from the drop-down and click hollow and drill. Set wall thickness to 2 mm at minimum, though if you are printing larger than 10 cm tall, you probably want thicker than that. Reduce closing distance to 1 mm, then click Slice Now and quickly go to the printing preview to see if there are any issues. If there aren't any, right-click on the hollow items and export them as STL, one by one. In Blender, re-import these models into a new collection. The problem with re-imported models is that their outside shell could be irreparably destroyed, especially if Prusa Slicer asks you to fix the model, but the inside wall is fine. We need to transfer the inner wall from the hollow part to the original mesh. Move the hollow parts so that they align with the originals. Then hide the collection with the original models. For each hollow part, go to Edit mode and click on any vertex or face on the outside. Press Ctrl L followed by Delete Faces to get rid of the outside shell of the hollow model. Unhide the collection with the original models and merge the meshes belonging to original mesh and the mesh of the hollow object by pressing Ctrl J. Lastly, go back to Object mode and draw a cylinder to punch through walls. Ideally, the wire hole should be going through the center of the peg and its hole. However, if the peg is less than 2 mm wide, you should put the wire hole at the side of the peg. Make sure that the wire hole on the hole side of the joint is aligned with the wire hole on the peg side of the joint. At this point, Also, don't forget to ensure that there's enough space on the inside of your mini to run your wires. If the cavity gets too narrow, make it larger, but try to not decrease wall thickness to under 1 mm. If making wire tunnel big enough for wires could decrease the wall thickness to under 1 mm, you should really create a channel for wires on the outside of the model and then fill it in later after the model is printed with some filling substance. And again, make sure that the wire tunnels and channels are wide enough for your wires you are using. Congrats, you are now done with Blender. Check your mini for any problems and then send it off for 3D printing. Editor Miahen on this chapter's episode of If You Forgot It's Not Important, where can you get your 3D mini printed? If you have a 3D printer, obviously you know the drill. If you don't, then Google can be used to find people who offer 3D printing as a service. However, those 3D printing services can be a little bit expensive. Alternatively, your local D&D or mini painting community might, but is absolutely not guaranteed, to have people who may be willing to print your minis for you, though pricing details may vary. When you receive your 3D print, check if everything came out as expected before assembling. Then remove any stray supports and start painting and assembling. It doesn't matter in which order. By the way, notice how the stuff is bent? That's because it hasn't cured properly. If that happens to you, straighten it out and put it out on the sun for a day. Though this shouldn't happen if you are paying a professional service to print your mini for you. If you watched this video, chances are you are pretty familiar with the miniature painting. But if you are just thinking about getting into the hobby, if you are new to painting and think that 30 to 50 orans for a starter set of paints is too much, find a local game store that sells Warhammer or D&D minis and politely ask about mini painting and whether they host any mini painting sessions for public. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the people might even let you try for free. If you think 30 to 50 euros is a fair price to pay to avoid socializing, spit paints probably shouldn't be your first purchase. Buy acrylics instead. Do yourself a favor and stay away from Citadel paints like your teammates stay away from objective while doing PvP. Citadel pots are hot garbage and designed to maximize leaks and premature drying of your paints. Anyway, happy painting! I actually don't have any decent clips of me painting the mini because this was mostly a Blender video. However, if you are new to the hobby, thin brushes are overrated. You don't need to have a very thin brush to get tiny details. Having a brush with a good tip is more important than having thin brush. Thin brushes kinda suck because they can't hold a lot of paint inside them. So yeah, just ensure that you have a reasonably sized brush with a decent tip. Flat brushes are kinda situational, but I like them for certain details, such as this net. Initially, I intended to showcase this mini on a local convention. However, I learned all Blender lessons in this video the hard way, so the mini wasn't done for the convention. I barely even managed to have it ready for the next convention I went to. I literally painted the mini on the ferry ride to the island. But yeah, that's enough about painting, so let's move on to some notes about LEDs. SMD LEDs are something you can solder on wire by hand with enough patience and equipment, at least as long as LED is of the 2-ish by 1-ish mm variety. Wiring and placing LEDs inside your mini is a massive pain. On scale from 0 to Chalice of Tears, it kinda ranks off the chart. By the way, make sure that everything works before you glue it in, because it would be a great shame if you superglued everything in and then it turned out that the LED didn't work, which is something that totally hasn't happened to me. I also didn't capture the entire process of getting the wires through the mini. This process can be very long and very annoying. So here is some quick tips. Getting the wire through the part of the mini can be easier in one way than in the other. However, the easier way can be opposite of the convenient way or the only possible way. In that case, you can use a guide wire. The idea is that you drag the guide wire through the mini first, twist it around your real wire, and then pull both of the wires through the mini. Second note, the wires don't really like tight bends. However, I have pretty much 90-degree turn at the heel. I initially thought that I could get wire to bend around one 90-degree turn, however, that turned out to be incorrect. So instead I drilled a hole through the heel, and then I made a hook out of the wire. I inserted the hook through the desired exit hole and pushed it all the way to the heel hole. Then I inserted a guide wire through the loop and got it all the way through the leg. On the other side, I twisted the guide wire around the real wire and pulled everything through the leg. First, I dragged the wires through the heel hole, and then, once everything was out through the heel hole, I dragged the hook out from the desired exit hole. This pulled all wires through the heel, back inside, and then out through the desired correct exit hole. 0 out of 10, I would not do this again. Sometimes LEDs can be too large for what you want. In the case of this mini, I really wanted to have some magic lighting, maybe bioluminescence of the bush, maybe fireflies, and even the smallest SMD LED that can be soldered by hand is a bit too large for this application. The answer to this was optic fiber. You can get 1/4 mm or 0.1 mm optic fiber on AliExpress for cheap, though 0.1 mm is kinda hard to find. I also made this optic fiber holder. On one end you put the SMD LED, on the other end you put optic fiber, and yeah, the light now goes from LED to the end of the optic fiber. Then all you have to do is to pull the optic fiber through the base, which is a lot harder than it seems. In general, the tightest recommended radius of a band of optic fiber is about 10 times its radius, which sounds like a lot when your radius is under 1 mm. No, 10 times less than 1 mm is still quite some distance. The optic fibers can get very stiff at tight radiuses, so keep that in mind if you want to go the optic fiber route. I ended up supergluing those optic fiber holders into the base of the mini, right next to the resistors. So I guess that's it for this video. Yes, I know. The runtime got a little bit out of hand, but that's how you steal char minis from Guild Wars 2. Thanks for watching, all 5 of you.